Welcome to Taiwan Talks, covering the latest global news from a Taiwan perspective. I'm Annie Kuo. U.S. President Joe Biden highlighted in his recent UN address commitment to avoid containment in U.S. China relations. This approach is to responsibly manage competition with a focus on de-risking rather than decoupling. The uptick in high-level exchanges prompts speculation about a potential shift in relations or underlying strategic considerations. Joining us today are Wenchi Yu, Harvard Kennedy School Research Fellow, and Chenlung Kuo, United Daily News Deputy Editor-in-Chief. Welcome to the show. Now, before we begin, I would like to take a moment and look at Biden's statement regarding U.S.-China relations.
Now, let me be clear. None of these partnerships are about containing any country. They're about a positive vision for our shared future. When it comes to China, I want to be clear and consistent. We seek to responsibly manage the competition between our countries so it does not tip into conflict. I've said we are for de-risking, not decoupling with China.
As we all heard earlier from Biden's statement, I think he made it really serious about a statement that rather than decoupling, we're actually shifting to de-risking. So Wenchi, I would like to move to you. When he said de-risking, what do you think is the real meaning behind that, and how do you perceive this approach?
Yeah, first of all, I actually think it's a really smart choice of word compared to decoupling, which was pretty much started in the Trump administration. The Biden administration really wants to make a difference. And de-risking basically implies that China is actually a risk factor. And it's not just about U.S.-China relations, it's actually about China is a risk to the world. Right. So the whole world actually needs to manage this country, whether it's its political system, its economic system, or military threats, right? So, but it also suggests that compared to decoupling, which seems more dramatic and scary to a lot of people who've been engaging China for a long time. So this still implies that, no, the U.S. still wants to engage with China. It's just more targeted, and it's not a complete decoupling from China. So I actually think it shows that the Biden administration seems to be more strategic and more thoughtful about its relationship with China.
But do you think by using the word de-risking, it is going to ultimately alleviate the tension between the two superpower countries as well?
Not necessarily, because I mean the fact that the U.S. is saying China is a risk, right? It already paints China as in the picture that its political system, as I said, it's less likely to be stable. Its economic situation is not doing well. So again, like, nobody likes risks. Right. Like, it's not a positive word for sure. It's something that everyone has to deal with. It's not something that, because in the past, especially during the Trump administration, a lot of people are saying, okay, U.S. is being provocative, right? Like trying to challenge, not challenge it, but trying to sort of look at China as a challenger. Right. But this again sort of puts almost like the burden on China to say this is not our problem. China is the problem now.
And Chenlung, do you agree with this?
Yes. I think that you have to remember that it's in the context of UN General Assembly that I think a lot of the words is addressing actually to the global South countries. Right. Those countries are afraid that eventually that China and the U.S. will get into a conflict. So by addressing that, Biden is emphasizing that we are going to manage the relation between China and the United States, that we are not going to decouple, but rather to de-risk the relation we have. I think it's a moderate approach for a lot of countries who are afraid that we are going to witness that Cold War 2.0. Right.
And I think that's exactly echoes to what you were saying. This is exactly why Biden wanted to emphasize this even more during the UN Assembly when de-risking was actually brought out, I believe, in G7. But to follow up on what you were saying, for the UN Assembly, we're actually seeing a lot of the permanent members from the Security Council that were absent, including France, the UK, and of course China and Russia. So what do you think, is this intentionally?
already there's several occasions that people, all those major countries are addressing the issue by themselves, like the G7 that has been held in Japan, and also the G20 that is held in India. And I think that now Russia have been banned from participating in a lot of international events because of sanction. And China, I think Xi Jinping tried to avoid this trip in order to highlight the trip he's going to have in November in San Francisco. So a lot of countries' leaders, especially the Permanent Five, is skipping the New York event. There's other reason for instance, the French President Macron is hosting the King and Queen of Britain at the same time. That is not to say that they have a very different view on things. Rather, they sadly to say is that UN is now losing its importance in resolving the global affairs, I think.
And Wenchi, I see you're nodding your head.
Yes. I actually think the most important factor is the UN is no longer a place where people feel like you can solve a lot of problems. It was established, post World War II. It was an institution that was promising the world that there's not going to be any war, basically. And 70 years forward, or 80 almost, we're seeing that this kind of global institutions are no longer playing that role. Not only that, it often has become kind of a bottleneck, to be honest. And so, for example, in the U.S., especially the Republicans, pretty much don't trust the UN and its related agencies anymore, right? So it really wants the Congress to, defund UN agencies. So there's a lot of question about just the functionality as well as the effectiveness of those organizations. Of course, Biden, because he's a Democrat, naturally just trusts those global institutions more. But I do think for other permanent members, of course, I think China and Russia's absence, no one's really surprised. But French and British absence kind of is quite telling.
Okay. Like what Wenchi said earlier, with China and Russia's absence, it's not surprising at all. But do you think because of this absence, it actually gave Biden and Blinken an opportunity to really speak and also firm up relationships with other non-Western countries at the same time?
I actually don't think the UN Assembly this year is really the highlight. I know many friends are going actually because of other meetings, right? So usually during that time of the year, New York shuts down because there's so many other conferences going on.
Right.
And so this year, there's a SDG, Sustainable Development Goal conference that includes almost all developing countries.
Right.
And my understanding is that, Biden will be there, a lot of people will be there. So it's almost seen as more important in that sense because of Biden administration's agenda in engaging with developing world, which is in and of itself another competition with China, right? Because China is also engaged in developing relationships with those countries.
There's a lot of agenda going on with
Right.
the U.S. government as well, like what you said earlier, the SDG conference. Yes, Chenlung?
But I will still like to emphasize that people still pay a lot of attention to what Biden is saying, especially examine word by word what he really means. For instance, Biden did not mention about Taiwan or the Taiwan Strait in
Right.
this year's address.
Right.
And that made a lot of people worry that after Wang Yi's talk with Blinken in Malta,
Right.
and after Han Zheng is meeting with Blinken, would that means that the U.S. is going to have a new policy on Taiwan, or in order to have a consensus with China regarding the Biden and Xi Jinping summit, is Taiwan's interest is going to be sacrificed in a sense? I think that is the word by word examination people are looking very carefully about.
I think that's a very interesting point, and this really just follows up with my next question for you. Because without saying or mentioning Taiwan or cross-strait borders or tensions between China and Taiwan right now, it seems like Biden also wanted to prevent, like competition and turn it to a conflict. So do you think at the same time, the U.S. is actually still trying hard to kind of maintain an economic tie with China?
Yes, I think so. And this have been proven by the several cabinet ministers going there. The Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen and also Raimondo, the Commerce Secretary. And I think that there's a lot of emphasis coming from the Congress that Biden should have very strict restriction on the investment or going to have a technology transfer to China. But so far, it's still a wait and see attitude. Even the Huawei new phone that is coming out, there's a lot of speculation whether it had violated the technology transfer from the U.S. But still, there's no more news coming from the American administrations. So I think that they do want to have a closer economic relations with China so far. There's no room for ruining that kind of relations.
But like just what you said earlier, it seems like there's still going to be greater tension, especially of what just happened to Huawei and advanced 7-nanometer chips.
Right.
At the same time, there is still ongoing semiconductor industry to cut down investments on Chinese chips. But at the same time, you want to maintain a really good relationship, or you don't want to make it worse. But at the same time, you're doing a lot more embargo, a lot more export controls to it. I mean, if you were China, or if it was China, how is China going to perceive this? Wenchi, what is your insight on this?
Yeah, I think let's not look at this as an overall economic, even de-risking or decoupling, right? It's, if you look at what Biden administration is doing, which they're very proud of, and they think they're different from the Trump administration, is that they're really targeting advanced technologies that may benefit the People's Liberation Army. So it's grounded on security, national security concerns. Okay. So if you look at, for example, all the export controls and the bans and the restrictions, it's all about those advanced technologies, AI, quantum computing, etc. I mean, but the rest of the trade economic relationships, feel free to continue actually, exchange with each other. And in fact, last year, U.S. China trade relationship reached the highest quantity and volume ever, right? That actually says a lot about this very complicated relationship. Now, the question a lot of people do have is, can you really be that targeted, right? So if you say you're going to target certain, level of, for example, chips, is that even doable? And ultimately, this kind of restriction, there are two questions. One is, will this actually force China to accelerate its own research and development, so it'll become completely independent, which is obviously not what the U.S. wants to see. And then second, it will certainly affect American companies who are selling to China as well. So it is hurting American companies' business interests, right? However, they're using the argument of national security. So American businesses are willing to comply with government security concerns. However, if in the end, China develops even more advanced technology, the U.S. is not able to, hold its leadership, then ultimately you're not achieving your objective, you're hurting your own company. So there's a lot of question around the effectiveness of this kind of approach. And this is why we're seeing, basically the Republicans are saying, this is too naive, this is unrealistic, right? If you want to ban it all, including investments. So now they're going after like capital investment going into China Chinese technology they want the money to stop as well. It's not just technology, but the money as well.
I think Wenchi gave like a really good insight, and especially given the like the export controls, we're seeing that China can still be able to find some loopholes in order to break that. And also, like for instance, NVIDIA also stated that a continuous export control may also be a permanent loss for the U.S. in the future. So, what is your take on this, Chenlung?
I agree with what you have just said. It is a way to have a soft control on Chinese technology if you can still keep on investing in China and have full knowledge of the degree of the Chinese technology are. I think if you block it all, then that would force China to have some technology of their own. They have managed to build their own nuclear bomb during the Cold War period. They said they're going to have their own chips if the U.S. is going to block them. And whether that had proved itself during the new Huawei phone, that's another issue. I mean, I don't think that Huawei phone is that advanced, and especially the production amount maybe is the one that we should look more into it, because they may don't have that enough chips for the new phone yet. But this is something that worries the technology control authority in the U.S. a lot, right?
So we're seeing that ongoing tech competition really complicates the predictions for future U.S.-China relations. As we just mentioned earlier, recent high-level exchanges included a meeting between Blinken and China's Vice President Han Zheng, as well as a lengthy strategic session in Malta between Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi and U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan. Wang Yi also reiterated that Taiwan is a non-negotiable red line, urging the U.S. to uphold its commitment against supporting Taiwan independence. But now Taiwan's presidential election is coming up. So Chenlung, back to you again. What do you think is China intending to communicate to both the U.S. and Taiwan?
The nightmare for Xi Jinping nowadays is that it will paint oneself into a corner, that if he do not do anything regarding the Taiwan's general elections. His hypothesis is like this: if the new president for Taiwan is the one that is going to seek independence, and the U.S. is saying that to China that you should respect the result of Taiwan democracy, then he would have no resort but to use force. And that is the thing that he's most afraid to do, because China don't have enough capability to fight with the United States in the coming Taiwan Strait scenario. So for him is to do something that can prevent this kind of nightmare scenario. And that is the reason why Wang Yi wants to say that Taiwan is an insurmountable red line for the U.S. And he's hoping that U.S. can do something concrete that will help to stop this kind of trend going on. If this new president is going to seek an independence approach, that the U.S. should have full authority to pressure him, try to modify his approach. I think that is what the China had been hoping.
What about Wenchi? What's your take on this? Do you think there's a potential for China's stance to really affect the presidential election in Taiwan?
Well, I do think, right, every presidential election in Taiwan, China always, has to put on some kind of show to the world. It's, to show to the world as well as to its domestic audience. And, Taiwan issue is a red line. They've repeatedly said that over and over again. And what I find interesting is Beijing keeps using the framing of Taiwan independence to basically accuse certain candidates of, pro-independence, right? Even though you don't really see, those candidates even talking about Taiwan independence these days. My understanding is that I don't live in Taiwan, but my understanding is that, no one really talks openly about Taiwan independence anymore. That's also, I think the DPP understands that's also in an international society, almost like a not something, it could be accepted. And so the U.S. also keeps saying, the U.S. will not support Taiwan independence. So, so I'm not really sure, right? Obviously, Beijing is trying to again paint, the DPP and also a lot of the behavior of the current administration, anything as pro-Taiwan independence. Now, do you want to fall into that narrative or not, right? That's the fighting back, basically. I mean, the very existence of Taiwan is probably viewed as Taiwan independence as well. I mean, you can exaggerate and say that. And so I think that's, what the U.S. wants to fight back to China, saying, not everything is about Taiwan independence. It's just, a way of life. Taiwanese people want to choose the way to continue the way to live.
Yes.
But, if continuing this way of life, does that imply Taiwan independence as well, right? Like they can say whatever is Taiwan independence.
And as we're seeing now that all of the Taiwan's presidential candidates, they have visited the U.S., especially the most recent visit will be Ho Yo-yi from the KMT party. So Wenchi, what's your assessment of Ho's recent visit to the U.S.?
Because I actually participated in one of his first meetings in New York in the think tank, Council on Foreign Relations. So I have to say, I was surprised by what he
You're surprised?
said. Yes, I was surprised because first of all, obviously, Ho, in the past, there was no background, around foreign policy or cross-strait relations. Nobody really knows what his take is. And there's certain imagination of KMT's position, right? Like you would think, he is going to stick to the traditional KMT platform. However, he surprised a lot of people in the sense that the very first thing he said was about strengthening defense, right? He actually put defense as one of the first things he talks about. And he even criticized the DPP for not doing enough, right? He said he wants to increase the military reserves from 348,000 to 710,000. And he also said, the DPP is not helping the people to be prepared, right? He actually wants an all-out, civilian kind of awareness of national security, not just focus on the military only. So that sounds actually much more than what the DPP has been saying and doing. That's why I said I was surprised. However, of course, he still wants dialogue with Beijing. That's the main thing, right? The main difference, really, if you want to compare the current two parties in terms of just their cross-strait relationship, it's the KMT still wants to talk to Beijing. I mean, I'm sure the DPP would say they want to talk as well, but I can't imagine Beijing, talking to the DPP.
Right, opening a dialogue with the DPP. But Chenlung, so we just talked about Ho's recent visit to the U.S. What about the other three candidates that have also made a recent visit to the U.S.? So what is your overall assessment of this?
I think now the only two serious candidates will be William Lai and Ho Yi. The other two, I think the U.S. is not treating them very seriously.
When you say seriously, what do you mean?
Seriously meaning that they are not very likely to become a likely candidate in the Taiwan elections. I know that the U.S. have difficulty understanding Wen-che. I think that Wen-che sometimes would say something out of blue, and that is very difficult for U.S. And they consider Terry Kuo is another Han Kuo-yu that is of the left, of the right, I would say, that is not comparable with Ho Yo-yi. Ho Yo-yi, the final choice, I think, maybe it will be proven right that Ho Yo-yi is began with an apolitical candidate. He don't talk a lot about politics, but he is a quick learner. He knows which policy would be good for him. I think that is something that the U.S. is appreciate about, right?
So so we're kind of from what you just said earlier, I think it will give the audience a little bit kind of like a bigger image of the U.S. attitude towards the four candidates of Taiwan. But Wenchi, back to you. We're just talking about the U.S. overall general perception of the four candidates. But what about overseas Taiwanese civilians? How do they perceive these four candidates? That's something we would like to know.
Yeah, I actually don't think it's not that different from Taiwanese people living in Taiwan. I mean, it's always been very divided between the pro-green and pro-blue. And so, the question is whether they will, come to Taiwan to vote. I mean, because Taiwan has this very special arrangement for the overseas people to come back to Taiwan to vote. But other than that, from just what I'm seeing, those who are passionate about Taiwanese politics, I mean, it's very clear who they want to sort of align with.
But what about the current atmosphere? I mean, for KMT supporters, for DPP supporters, or even we're talking about maybe Ke supporters or Terry Guo supporters. Is it very divided, or are these supporters really just have their own stands? Is it very possible to see that they were very divided in who they choose for?
Yeah, I mean, my sort of, understanding and interaction with some of the people, especially, those older generation who've been, living in the U.S. for a long time, they really go along with the party line, right? So I think on the pan-blue side, maybe it's a little bit more challenging for them this time because they're not quite sure yet, right? But I think at the end of the day, who's going to basically represent, if there's some kind of consolidation, those people will go behind them. But it's, like I said, it's really along the party lines.
And Chenlung, any last
My
words for this?
experience about overseas Taiwanese or Chinese, they tend to be a little bit go to the extreme. If you are blue, you tend to be extreme blue. If you are green, you tend to be extreme green. And that is because they don't live in Taiwan. I mean, in Taiwan, we know that politics is only part of our daily life. I mean, we know people from the blue as well as from the green. So we don't tend to be that extreme. But people living in overseas, they only saw that from internet or from television. They tend to be put that to extreme.
All right, thank you, Chenlung and Wenchi. If you like our show, please search for us on YouTube, give us a thumbs up, and hit subscribe to our channel. Feel free to leave us any feedback in the comments section. See you next time.